Thank you, Hans Olaf. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to use my introduction to give you a view of the future, because I think that's what we should do. So I'd like us to start by imagining that Britain had never been a member of the European Union, and a negotiation had started last week on an agreement between the EU and the UK. What would that future agreement look like? Well, Britain is one of the world's largest economies. It has been at the forefront of global economic progress and technological innovation for over 200 years. It has first-rate research centres and universities that are amongst the most vibrant, not just in Europe, but the world. Just one Cambridge college has more Nobel Prize winners than France. Britain is a member of the Security Council, one of the most important military powers with a nuclear defence capability. It is a pillar of the NATO alliance. Its intelligence services are at the forefront of the global fight against terrorism. It has a diplomatic service with a global reach, built on dozens of long-standing international relationships. Britain has been a champion of the rule of law, a free press and free speech for centuries. It has led the way in developing democratic, representative institutions, and it has built alliances with friends across the globe who share these values and who have worked equally hard to expand the respect for the individual as the foundation of political life, often in very difficult circumstances, so as to build sustainable democracies. So for reasons of economic prosperity, security interests and shared values, the agreement would be positive and far-reaching, or to use the British Prime Minister's phrase, a deep and special partnership. And that is the way we should view the negotiations that have started in Brussels last week, not simply about ending an old relationship, but building a new relationship for the long term. Now, I understand that millions across the continent and many of our friends and allies regret the decision of the British people to withdraw from the Union. Some of our partners are so upset and worried about the future that they think that Britain should be placed at some kind of political or economic disadvantage. Now, we understand the interests of the 27 must be respected, and they will be central to the negotiation. But creating disadvantages for the sake of imposing disadvantages would be a strategic mistake for all our countries concerned and for the whole of the Western world. The West faces enormous economic, security and political challenges now and in the century ahead. This is not the time to be petty, to seek short-term gain, or to focus on the parochial. Our times require statesmanship of the first order, leaders in public life whose long-term vision is of the same magnitude of those who built the Western global order after the Second World War. If the British government has set out an agenda for a global Britain, I hope we will find a willing partner in a global Europe. Let me turn now to the domestic political scene in the United Kingdom to set the scene for the negotiation. The starting point is, of course, the referendum, which took place just over 1 year ago. This may not have been the decision that all of you wanted or expected, and I know that many of you will have concerns about what it means for your countries and their futures in the EU. But this was a democratic decision which we must and will respect. And whilst one can criticise both campaigns for exaggerating their arguments, the British people knew what they were doing and they have made their choice. The task of British politicians is now to implement it, not to quibble with the result. Now, as part of that effort, our Prime Minister called an election some 2 months ago, hoping it would give 5 years of stable government. Now, the result we achieved was as disappointing as it was surprising. But in my view, this may still deliver the intended benefits. Firstly, the Conservative vote is actually as strong, if not stronger, on election day as it was 2 years before. In fact, it's one of the highest levels of support of a government in living memory. This is a fact that's mysteriously overlooked by many commentators, especially Mr. Verhofstadt, both in Britain and abroad. So it may well be that we now have 5 years to carry out the negotiation and implement any agreement without a subsequent election calling any part of it into question. I hope it will mean the House of Commons can pass the necessary legislation. The election may also have ended the hopes of the Scottish nationalists to undermine the negotiation with their threat to hold a second referendum on independence. This idea was clearly rejected by the Scottish electorate, where unionist parties, particularly the Conservative and Unionist Party in Scotland, did extremely well. This will make the negotiation more stable. Finally, it is clear that the British people did not use the election to rerun the referendum and seek to change the result. This had been the hope of some hardline Remainers who refused to accept last June's result. But actually, those parties most obsessed by Europe, by which I mean the Liberal Democrats, did very badly indeed. Labour itself equivocated during the campaign, paying lip service to respecting the result, whilst hoping not to offend Remain-leaning potential supporters. They gained support primarily on ending austerity and throwing money at political problems, in effect bribing the electorate with its own money. There is, sadly, a whole generation or two who have forgotten the words of Margaret Thatcher, that the problem with socialism is eventually you run out of other people's money. That in itself is a major problem that we will need to address, and perhaps not just in Britain. But that is not the subject today. There is, of course, much more than could be said about the election, but I just wanted here to offer a quick summary rather than discuss it in detail. The number of British MPs in the House of Commons, I would say, will not greatly affect the negotiating strength of the British government. And here I'm going to quote, with approval, our old friend Mr. Verhofstadt. Before the election was held, he said this, and I quote, "The theory espoused by some that Theresa May is calling a general election on Brexit in order to secure a better deal with the EU is nonsensical. Will the election of more Tory MPs give Theresa May a greater chance of securing a better Brexit deal? For those sitting around the table in Brussels, this is an irrelevance." Fair enough. We actually secured slightly fewer MPs. I assume that is equally irrelevant to the Brussels negotiators. Now, there are some who are trying to retell the story of the election to pretend it was between two kinds of Brexit, a so-called soft Brexit and a so-called hard Brexit. Indeed, there is a lot of loose talk about a hard Brexit versus a soft Brexit, as if these two terms had some clear sort of meaning. But the kind of Brexit would be constructed during the course of negotiations and will, I hope, simply be the best Brexit. Best for all sides, best for the UK, and also best for our 27 partners. This will not come about by choosing between two kinds of Brexit as if these are simply ready to be taken off a shelf. They are not. The reality is that the final form of the deal will come about following a negotiation. Some of the choices have already been made by all 28 participants. and let me focus on a couple to start. Free movement and the so-called four freedoms of the single market. This was perhaps the single most important policy question during the referendum campaign, sitting alongside the constitutional question of being in a supranational union. Undoubtedly, the most important issue of the British people was the issue of freedom of movement. Whether we like it or not, the scale of EU migration over recent years had reached a level that was not anticipated and was felt by many in the UK to be too high. Individually, the EU citizens that have been welcomed to Britain in recent times have almost all made a positive contribution to my country. But overall, 3 million people arriving in such a short space of time caused concerns and was undoubtedly a challenge which public services, such as housing and education, struggled to meet. So whilst the vast majority of the British people have welcomed their new neighbours, they felt overall the numbers were too high. And that is why David Cameron was so keen to get a meaningful cap or emergency brake on overall numbers to address these concerns. Now, given the referendum result, free movement as we know it must end. The EU response has been to reassert that the four different components of the single market, free movement of goods, services, capital and people, are indivisible. This doctrine of indivisibility is a relatively new addition to the EU's vocabulary, having only been invented for reasons of public relations in the 1980s to sell the concept of the single market to the public. But it has now been repeated so often that it has become an unavoidable truth. The policy consequence of this stance is that regardless of whether it is a preferred option or not, the UK has to leave the single market. And outside the single market, it would need to make the best of trade opportunities around the world. And so Britain needs the freedom to set its own trade policies. That means inevitably we must leave the customs union. So all this talk of a soft Brexit or a hard Brexit, I would argue, is meaningless. We are leaving the single market and we are leaving the customs union. My central hope is that we are able to secure a Brexit that works well for Britain and well for all of us. Let me share with you a few of the key elements of what such an agreement might look like from the perspective of the British government. The first point I want to emphasise is the government is determined that the referendum is not used to drive the country to an isolationist stance, nor does the UK government want the British decision to leave to undermine the European Union as a whole. We want the EU to prosper. As Prime Minister May said in her Lancaster House speech in January, she said, "I know many fear that the British decision might herald the beginning of a greater unravelling of the EU. But let me be clear, I do not want that to happen. It would not be in the best interests of Britain. It remains overwhelmingly and compellingly in Britain's national interest that the EU should succeed. And that is why I hope in the months and years ahead, we'll all reflect on the lessons of Britain's decision to leave." The British government has set out 12 objectives to build a new, positive and constructive partnership between Britain and the EU, and I'd like to run through those points. Our first objective is certainty. The UK government wants to achieve certainty for business and citizens alike. This is a key reason we are so keen to see a deal on the rights of our citizens reached as soon as possible. A Great Repeal Bill is to be introduced shortly in Parliament to incorporate into UK law all the legislation that is currently only guaranteed by EU law. This avoids any uncertainty. Secondly, control of our own laws. Given that this too was central to the referendum campaign, we will need full control of our laws, which means Britain cannot be subject to the European Court of Justice in the future. The third point is to strengthen the union of the United Kingdom. It is likely the general election may have helped in resetting the political debate in Scotland. This point also underlines the priority the interests of Northern Ireland will have in the negotiation, which shapes the fourth priority issue. That is to maintain the common travel area with the Republic of Ireland. This area of free movement predates our common membership of the EU, and I hope it can be maintained. The fifth point was control of immigration, and I've touched on this already. The government is not proposing to shut the border, far from it. It wants to establish a system that attracts the brightest and the best to work and study in Britain from around the world. The key issue here is one of control and of designing an immigration policy in Westminster. The next point is the one Theresa May emphasised in Brussels last week, the rights of EU nationals in Britain and British nationals in the EU. The next point is a domestic consideration, to protect workers' rights. And that's why all EU rights will be enshrined in British law, and no British worker will see a diminution in those rights. The eighth point will be central, I hope, to the negotiations, and this is establishing free trade with European markets. There is no need to introduce artificial barriers just for the sake of it. Britain hopes, therefore, to secure the greatest possible access to the single market on a fully reciprocal basis. The next point relates to commercial policy, as Britain intends to seek new trade agreements with other countries. This, of course, means we must leave the customs union in order to do that. Another point relates to science and innovation, to make sure that Britain is one of the best places in the world for research. The 11th point is one that is a central concern to all of us: cooperation in the fight against crime and terrorism. Britain will continue to cooperate with its European partners in important areas such as crime, terrorism, and foreign affairs. It is also worth noting that the Prime Minister specifically listed, including practical arrangements on the matters of law enforcement and the sharing of intelligence material with our EU allies. The final British objective is that there should be a smooth, orderly Brexit, which will benefit both Britain and the EU. Hans-Olaf, let me conclude by returning to where I started. The key objective for all of us at this time must be a long-term future for all our individual member states, the United Kingdom, and the European Union. We know that these negotiations will be difficult at times, but none of us must lose sight of the long term. I ask all of you to bear in mind that what we want is a good agreement and not a good fight. Let us keep that good agreement on the horizon, and let us work together to achieve that. Thank you.